r/Life of Norman, narrated by the bearded Brit. Norman was excited. He had a weekend sandwiched by 4 days of holiday in 6 months, and Norman wanted to enjoy it as much as possible. He browsed the internet looking for the cheapest but safest flights to Britain. Norman had once watched a British TV show, and though a bit racy for him, it had piqued his interests about the culture of this faraway land. Norman estimated that he was about 10 clicks away from booking his flight, which caused him to start sweating. Looking over at Norman, panic started to set in. Who would feed Norman? How could he trust them to give him the right food at the right time? What if his son, whom he hadn't spoken to in a while, decided to give him a visit? This was all too much for Norman, who had to take a step away from the computer and make himself a hastily brewed tea. What a preposterous idea that was, Norman thought to himself with a smile, adrenaline still coursing through his veins at the thought that he'd nearly done it. I think CSI will be as good as it gets for me, Norman thought as he chuckled to himself, sipping his tea, flicking on the TV and stroking a dozing Norman. "5 months, 3 weeks and 1 day ago, Norman had nearly gone to Britain. He tried to move on with his life, and for the most part had succeeded. In some senses, his life had actually improved. He was keeping to his sleeping schedule, 10 PM till 6 AM, better than ever, and the magazines at work had been consistently entertaining, providing him with more than enough to read and smirk at during his lunches. Moreover, he had grown closer with Norman in these last few months, having actually managed to shake his hand for a treat. Despite this, something had awoken in Norman, which was something akin to the deepest desire for adventure. He thought of Britain, and its magical land of teas and scones, and craved something of the sort. His holidays were fast approaching, so in an act of pure impulse, he began to once again browse the internet, something he had rarely done since that heart-wrenching day. His palms began to sweat as he searched fun things to do in his areas. Paintballing? I think not, Norman scoffed, dismissing the potential death trap disguised as entertainment. After an intense 30 minutes of scrolling, which was nearly the longest time Norman had ever spent browsing the web at his own pleasure, his eyes lit up. Norman, I found it! I know what I'm going to do! Norman lifted his weary head up off of his cushion, but soon settled back down. Despite the cat's uninterestedness, Norman was elated. In his eyes was the reflection of the prettiest apple tree he'd ever seen. He had found what his heart was longing for. On the screen read, "Appleberry's Apple Orchard, pick your own apples." Not only was this just out of town, perfectly satiating the hunger for adventure, but it also gave him the opportunity to try something he'd never done before. His stomach gurgled for the crunch of an apple that he had picked off the tree. Norman booked himself in, shaking with pleasure, and gently shut his laptop screen, despite the desire to jump up and down for joy. He had done it. Norman was going on holiday. He pondered about the possibility of even staying there the night at a local hostel, but quickly told himself not to get carried away, because he'd only regret it later. With the click of the kettle and a glance at his watch, Norman began his normal nightly routine, but with just a bit more of a spring in his step perhaps. It was just another day for Norman. He left the office at his usual time and climbed into his 2002 Sedona. On the way home, he encountered a red light. He depressed his foot on the brake and the car stopped. When the light turned green, he removed his foot from the brake, applied it to the accelerator and continued on his way home. Norman smiled. He liked it when everything went to plan. He was particularly looking forward to this evening as he had prepared 2 dinners the night before and didn't need to cook tonight. This allowed for additional time to watch reruns of CSI. There was a favourite episode of his he hadn't seen for at least 3 weeks, and he had planned to watch this in addition to just the one he usually viewed nightly. Norman joined him on the couch as Norman watched both episodes. Norman smiled. It had been a fine evening, but as it was now nearly 10 PM and getting late, he decided to take a shower. Norman meowed at him. "I know, Norman, won't be long," Norman said. "I'll feed you once I've had my shower." Upon entering the shower, Norman frowned. "Dang it," he said. It had totally slipped his mind that the shower tap was broken and that he should have called the plumber during his lunch break. He made a mental note to not read so many of the magazines at work tomorrow during his lunch break. The excitement of his newfound discovery, in particular the Natural Geographic editions, had been somewhat distracting. Whilst Norman owned a bath, he found the idea of bathing in his own dirty water hideous and much preferred showers. No time to be a princess tonight though, he thought as he filled the bath to just the perfect temperature. I'll just make it quick. Upon entering the bath, Norman did find the water somewhat soothing. He briefly closed his eyes and relaxed, recounting the evening's episodes of CSI. Norman began to scratch at the bathroom door, jolting Norman back to reality from his state of relaxation. He berated himself for being so slothful and ignoring his duties to feed Norman. He quickly toweled himself off and put on his new terry cloth bathrobe, purchased from Target at the same time as the long-sleeve turtleneck. He rushed to feed Norman. Norman purred and brushed against Norman's leg, forgiving him immediately. As Norman lay in bed that night, he thought about how he had enjoyed his bath and that he may consider having one again tomorrow. Norman laughed at his own joke. He felt a small pang of regret that he no longer had somebody to share his humour and quick wit with. It was now 11:03 PM and way past Norman's bedtime. Today had been a disaster. Tomorrow will be better, Norman thought hopefully as he switched down the light. If you like this video, let me know by pressing the like button, or by leaving me a comment about how annoyed you get when you can't tell if it's actually a high-pitched noise or if it's just your tinnitus playing up. For more of these videos, you should subscribe to this channel as I aim to post 2 to 3 videos a week. Don't forget to let me know your favourite Norman stories and I'll try to include them in future videos. As per the norm, you'll find links to the featured stories as well as links to the recording gear I use in the description below.